Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Human Rights Centre seminar today on managing the dead and the COVID-19 outbreak. My name is Cheryl Lawther, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the current director of the Human Rights Centre at Queen's. In light of the current situation and being unable to meet in person, we took the decision to move our seminar series online and to really address some of the most challenging and the most pressing issues in light of the coronavirus outbreak. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome two of our expert speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Heather Conway, who is Professor of Property Law and Death Studies in the School of Law at Queen's. Her book, The Law and the Dead, was published in 2016, and as the title suggests, it focuses on the legal framework around death, burial, cremation, exhumation, and memorialisation. Professor Conway also writes and researches on property and succession law, and has recently provided guidance on COVID-19 and the treatment of the dead to the Deceased Management Authority Advisory Group, and has also written an article on how coronavirus is changing funerals for the conversation. If you would like to look it up, and I would encourage you to do so, our first piece in the conversation, entitled 5 Laws About the Dead That Might Spook You, has now been read over 750,000 times. Our second speaker today is Professor Anne-Maree Farrell. Anne-Maree is also Professor of Law at Queen's, and her research expertise lies in health and medical law. Her particular interests are in law and the ethics of human bodies, body parts and tissue, as well as the politics and regulation of public health risks. In a past life, Anne-Maree also worked as a lawyer in private practice in Australia and in Ireland as well. In terms of the topic under conversation today, Anne-Maree is interested in what the dead can tell us about how we manage risks to health at individual and population levels, about our body politic, and about broader questions in global health security. More recently, she's also published on forensic practices and issues around the identification of the dead in international disaster response situations. As I said, our first speaker today is Professor Heather Conway, and what we will do is our speakers will speak for approximately 20 minutes each, and then we'll have a short period of time at the end for question and answer. If you do have any questions or any comments as we go along, I'd encourage you to use the chat function on Teams, and I will moderate those questions at the end. Just as a matter of housekeeping as well, if everyone could keep their videos and their microphones off, that will help us proceed smoothly. So I'll hand over to Heather now. The title of Heather's talk today is Managing the Dead and the COVID-19 Outbreak, the Ethics, Rights and Regulations of Funerals. In her talk today, Heather is going to look at how COVID-19 is changing our way of death, how the law has traditionally regulated death, the emergency provisions across the UK and Ireland, and on the back of these, whether funerals can be considered a human right and whether the current provisions are in fact human rights compliant. Heather, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. I assume that I am visible and have my mic on. And thank you for the invitation to speak at the Human Rights Centre seminar today. Coping with a very different way of life is not the only challenge that we're all facing now. The global pandemic that is coronavirus has aggressively dismantled our way of death as well in a manner that we wouldn't really have thought possible just a few short months ago. As the death rate climbs globally, and with the UK in particular having one of the highest numerical death totals in Europe, what happens to the dead has now become an urgent, much publicised issue. This dark reality creates its own mental pressures, I think. Death is the one fate that awaits us all, but it's something that we don't want to contemplate. Talking about death, admitting its inevitability, has become something of a social taboo. And a lot of this has been attributed to the fact that we've become what's been described as a death-denying society. Philippe Arias, in his seminal text, The Hour of Our Death, published in 1981, described this as a modern 20th century phenomenon. It's been triggered by the fact that death has been removed from everyday life. We're used to people dying in hospitals and nursing homes. The management of death and dying has been taken out of our homes and our everyday experiences. But COVID-19 has made death a daily fact of life. We see the images, we see the stark reminders everywhere. We see how the Grim Reaper is no respecter of age or status, of economic or social demographics, of geographical boundaries. The harsh and painful realities of death surround all of us on a daily basis. Aligned with that, we have the practicalities and social consequences of dealing with the dead, and all countries worldwide have had to address that as part of their planning process for dealing with COVID-19 and as they move through the pandemic. In the UK, for example, the Coronavirus Act introduced a range of sweeping powers designed to allow public bodies to respond to the pandemic as pressures on the system increased. The Act and ancillary pieces of legislation passed in recent weeks impacting key aspects of death certifications dealing with the dead and how funerals are conducted. And those measures apply here in Northern Ireland. We also see very similar restrictions imposed in Ireland. And I'd like to focus on those restrictions today. How funerals are being carried out in our new, rather surreal, and that's the word that I keep using, COVID-19 world. We now have emergency laws impacting an ordinary private funeral. And we all know that the law is traditionally reluctant to interfere in the private family affair. But now we have this very direct encroachment in funerals, and that's something that we haven't seen. Before I look at the emergency provisions, I think it's important that we look at the two ways in which the law has always dealt with the dead, and its treatment has always been based on two things: ingrained notions of respect for the dead and public health concerns around speedy burial or cremation of decaying corpses. Now, those two core values are self-explanatory. The first one speaks to basic notions of human dignity. Also, as a society and as individuals, we care how human beings are going to be treated because it gives us a sense of existential comfort about what will happen to our own bodies when we die. The second speaks to the threat of disease. Decaying corpses pose an obvious threat to public health. The dead must be separated from the living to prevent this from happening. Now, both of those core values tend to have equal billing. They counterbalance each other in what we might think of as a delicately poised set of scales. Each side represents one of the twin imperatives: public health, respect for the dead. In pandemics such as this one and in other emergency situations, for example, natural disasters, we have a large-scale loss of life. The balance inevitably shifts to public health, and our scales tilt further to that particular side. We're used to seeing emergency laws triggered in war situations in response to things like terrorist threats, but here we have emergency laws being passed to deal with a threat caused by a virus, by a global pandemic. Well, I think it's interesting as a side point that a lot of government rhetoric around COVID-19 has talked about being on a war footing. But if we think about our twin correlates, respect for the dead and public health, respect for the dead is a universal standard. We see examples of it, for example, in international humanitarian laws that forbid the desecration or mutilation of those killed in armed conflict. They require the dead to be respectfully interred where that's possible. If we look at the emergency guidance that surrounds the legislation, the emergency legislation around coronavirus, there are references there to treating the dead with care and respect. It's all in there. But the actual provisions themselves, the emergency legislative provisions that we're talking about for dealing with dead bodies, they're very much predicated on public health grounds, so with a few caveats that I'll come back to. The thinking behind the emergency laws when we're talking about the dead, it's really two ideas. We want to ensure that our cemeteries, our crematoria, our morgues, our death care systems, that they do not become overwhelmed and that funerals can still take place so that the living can say goodbye to the dead. But I think looking through those provisions, a couple of things to me stand out. We have fairly extensive provisions on the storage, transport and disposal of bodies. There were steps in there about preparatory measures and what powers would be available as the pandemic took hold. And we've seen examples of that already. We've all read about local authorities setting up temporary morgues to cope with increased demand, setting aside additional grave plots. In Northern Ireland, we had stories recently about those grave plots actually being dug in advance to cope with the predicted number of deaths. The emergency legislation also contemplates restrictions on the transport of bodies. It also talks about quarantining the dead if there's a danger of contamination. Well, thankfully, those are measures that we haven't had to implement to date. And it's easy to see the public health emphasis here. Do whatever it takes to ensure that the system does not become overwhelmed. And we've unfortunately seen examples of this elsewhere in other countries where large-scale numbers of death have really overwhelmed the local infrastructure. We saw examples of that in Bergamo in Italy, where bodies had to be moved from one region to another because the one crematorium couldn't cope. In Ecuador, I read stories recently about families having to leave the bodies of loved ones outside in heat and cardboard boxes to be collected because they couldn't be stored anywhere, and it wasn't safe to keep them in the houses. The other big thing looking at the emergency legislation are the severe restrictions that have been imposed on funerals. And to me, that's the most significant feature. And it's something that encroaches on one of our oldest and dearest social cultural traditions, especially throughout Ireland. If we think about funerals have tended to be based more on social, religious and cultural customs than on formal rules of law. Yes, we always have strict legal rules around things like where you site a graveyard, the minimum depth you need for a grave, the siting of crematoria. The sort of logistics and the sanitary elements of burials and cremation are regulated, but not the actual ritualistic and participatory elements of funerals. And that's something that we see changing significantly in recent weeks. Bereaved families are now experiencing very different funerals than they might have otherwise envisaged. And if we think about what's the purpose of a funeral, because I think that's an important point to bear in mind, funerals do more than remove the threat of disease posed by decaying corpses. They're important social rituals. They mark the life of the deceased. They allow family and friends to come together to remember and to mourn. And also they allow family and friends to draw social support from members of the community who gather to pay their respects to the person who's passed away. But the emergency laws have had a very significant impact on the way in which funerals are conducted. And that's both for COVID-19 and for non-virus deaths. And I think that's an important one to bear in mind. Taking our position here in Northern Ireland, and as part of the lockdown measures that were introduced throughout the UK on the 23rd of March, funerals were still allowed to go ahead. That was really to prevent the system from being backed up, but with attendance limited to immediate family. The rationale behind that was to make social distancing easier, to protect not only the small number of attendees, but also funeral directors and key members of the death care industry, who play such a vital role in these challenging times. So funerals are really restricted to immediate family, and family was not defined there. And I think that was a very sensible decision. Families take all sorts of different forms, and we couldn't have introduced a one-size-fits-all definition. So there's discretion around who you class as family. Regulations published further into lockdown list funerals as an exception to the restrictions on movement that prevent people from leaving their homes without reasonable excuse. And they also allow gatherings of 2 or more people. That's an exception to the general rule. The regulations also state clearly that beyond the funeral director, chapel attendant and funeral staff, you have strict attendance, limited to members of the deceased household, close family, or close friends if neither of the other 2 groups can attend. You can also have your celebrant of choice. The legislation makes it clear that social distancing requirements have to be maintained at all times while travelling to and from and while attending the funeral. And it also says that mourners who are self-isolating because of suspected COVID-19 symptoms, suspected COVID-19 but who are asymptomatic can attend, as can those in vulnerable or protected groups. But it makes it quite clear that if you're showing coronavirus symptoms for obvious reasons, you stay away. We see similar measures in Ireland. When government guidance was first published on the 28th of March, funerals were listed as one of the critical services. Again, very strict rules in attendance, confined to members of the same household, immediate family only. Again, family wasn't defined for obvious reasons, or close friends as a default position. And again, provided that social distancing rules are respected. The numbers attending, now there was a numbers limit here, should not exceed 10 persons in Ireland. That's in places of worship and at the graveside, though that number might be lower in smaller enclosed places, and individual churches were allowed to put restrictions in place as well. And again, funerals were outside the restrictions of movement that only allowed people to travel within a 2-mile radius really from their homes. When we think about those restrictions, again, there's a very strong public health motivation here, but the narrative is slightly different. It's about stopping the transmission of disease between the living rather than curbing the threat of transmission from the dead. And what needs to be acknowledged here is that when we talk about protecting public health, and to me this is quite interesting, what are we doing? We're protecting public health, but we're protecting physical health more so. We're curbing the spread of a disease. The emergency regulations across Ireland recognise that funerals are vital for the health and well-being of the bereaved. You must be allowed to say goodbye to your dead. It's an essential part of the grieving process, and in that sense there's a salient nod to mental health. But mental health is really subservient to physical health right now. But when we think about the emotional impact of altered funeral formats in the living, it's absolutely horrendous. Closed coffins prevent families from seeing a loved one who may have died alone in hospital or in a care home. The wider social support that funerals provide, such an important part of the grieving process, is also being lost. There's no wake, there's no viewing of the deceased, there's no shaking hands, there's no post-funeral gathering. That's a very ingrained part of the funeral ritual. It's such an ingrained part of our social fabric, and those things are now being lost. And those are hugely important to loved ones, to bereaved people, who see it as a key part of their emotional support and coping strategies. So bearing in mind that this is a human rights seminar, where am I going with this from a human rights perspective? And of course, I'm not a human rights lawyer, but I think that the emergency provisions dealing with funerals throw up some very interesting issues. Contributing to a media piece recently, the author of the piece asked me, are funerals a human right? And I suppose in one sense they are. The right to a dignified and a lawful funeral is such a fundamental and obvious one that it probably doesn't need to be enshrined as a basic right or as a human right in any human rights or other legal instrument. Maybe the better question to pose right now is whether there's a basic right to have the funeral you want, whether that's for yourself or for a dead loved one. Is not being able to have a particular type of funeral because of emergency restrictions an infringement of human rights, whether that's the human rights of the dead, the living, or maybe even both. Now, I have no doubt that could be a seminar in its own right and that it would trigger all sorts of debates. Are funerals about the living or are they about the dead? In my view, it's a combination of both. Do the dead have rights that can be protected under human rights or other legal instruments? What I'd like to do for the short time I have left is to really look at the restrictions or think about the restrictions we have in place right now. Are they human rights compliant? So the first thing I suppose I should acknowledge is that there hasn't been any sort of legal challenge, as far as I'm aware, across Ireland or in England, Wales, Scotland, to the emergency provisions restricting funerals. They seem to have been reluctantly and wearily accepted as part of the enforced changes we're all having to cope with due to COVID-19. Now, one suspects there would have been a much bigger outcry if funerals had been banned altogether, if there had been an outright ban on mourners, people attending. That was the case in Italy, of course, until lockdown measures were eased a couple of days ago. It was also mooted in Ireland initially. The National Association of Funeral Directors in Ireland said, should we actually just ban people from attending funerals? And unsurprisingly, there was a huge public outcry. What if we had moved to the situation in a more extreme scenario in which dead bodies were being hurriedly cremated or buried with no ceremony, if we'd moved to mass burials or mass cremations? Things like that might have prompted claims that basic human rights were being taken over by the sweeping powers that governments have given themselves now in emergency situations. But looking at the measures that we have here, funerals are taking place, but they're subject to very, very severe restrictions on both attendance and rituals. Can we make an argument, for example, that there has been an infringement of, say, Article 8 or Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights right now because the restrictions that we have in place? In theory, I think perhaps yes. In my book, The Law and the Dead, I argued that there was growing evidence in both the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights and in domestic courts that convention rights could influence the fate of the recently dead. If we take as one example the right to private and family life under Article 8.1, that includes the execution of funeral rights, and that's something that has been reflected in the jurisprudence of the European Court to date. take the decisions of Pinolo and Forday in France, Girard in France. Both those cases suggest a legitimate family interest in the fate of a loved one. More recently, the 2018 decision in Solska in Poland, the European Court of Human Rights accepted that, yes, Article 8 is more about relations between the living, but it extends to certain situations after death, including the way in which the body of a deceased relative is treated and issues regarding the ability to attend a funeral. Closer to home, we have the comments of Lord Brodie in the Scottish case of C and the Advocate General for Scotland. He said in that case, Article 8 can be engaged by an act of the state which touches on a family's freedom to determine what may be described as the place and modalities of burial of a deceased member of that family, to have custody of the body for the purposes of burial, and to participate in any funeral ceremony. And that's a fairly broad statement. We also have cases suggesting that Article 9.1, the rights to freedom of thought, conscience and religion, are engaged in issues around death and disposal of the dead. That's something that might be raised where restrictions on funerals impact on religious and cultural aspects of the funeral. For example, around the body being prepared, handled in a certain way. Time limits around the funeral, things like that. Of course, the flip side is evident as well. The rights guaranteed by Articles 8.1 and 9.1 are defeasible. We are allowed legitimate interference, whether that's in accordance with the rights imposed by, or the restrictions imposed by Articles 8.2 and 9.2. State interference is permissible where this is in accordance with the law or deemed to be necessary in the interest of public safety or for the protection of health or morals. And the global pandemic that is COVID-19, along with the fact that these are essential public health restrictions, and I think restrictions is important to bear in mind, not prohibitions. We have essential public health restrictions in funerals in unprecedented times that are intended to be temporary in their duration. Those things might, I think, negate any rights-based arguments for having traditional funerals as we knew them in the before COVID times. Some concluding thoughts then. Every society prides itself on how it treats its dead. But funerals as we know them are another one of our social rituals that we must regrettably but necessarily radically alter in the short term. And since advice from governments is that social distancing is likely to be with us from some time, I suspect it's going to be many months before funerals return to any semblance of normal, to any sense in which we used to know them. Now, I don't subscribe to the idea, as some people have suggested, that we'll move away from our cherished social and cultural traditions. The COVID-style funerals, low numbers of people attending, will become the new norm. I think that going back to the traditional funeral will be one of the many things that we embrace again when we finally emerge from living and dying in the shadow of coronavirus. Thank you, Cheryl. That concludes my section.
Thank you very much, Heather. That was absolutely fantastic. And it certainly raised a lot of questions for me. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Anne-Maree Farrell for the second part of our seminar this afternoon. Today, Anne-Maree will be looking at the ethical, the social and the political issues around how we understand the dead body during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as what that means in respect to law and regulation, and including human rights. So Anne-Maree, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm assuming you can see me, and that's working okay. I'd like to thank Cheryl and the Human Rights Centre for inviting me to speak today on a very interesting and challenging topic that's arisen in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Just picking up on what Heather was speaking about in her presentation, I can only agree that looking at the management of the dead and death management generally, that we're, particularly in the context of a pandemic, we're looking at questions around respect, but also public health. And she nicely broke down what that might mean. What I'd like to explore in my paper is a number of things. focusing, as Cheryl said, on ethical, social, legal issues around the dead body. And I'm going to look at how we understand that, particularly on an all-island basis, and some insights from the literature in that area. Then going on to look at the dead in relationship with their families, and how that's understood, and how we can understand it in the context of COVID-19 around ethical and social contexts. In the final part of the talk, I'm going to be focused on law and regulation. Again, very well covered by Heather in many respects. I suppose my interpretation of regulation would include human rights as a regime. I need to put my hand up and say as well, I'm not a human rights lawyer, but increasingly, and again, as Heather pointed out, human rights issues do encroach on this area and are a major issue, particularly at international level, in relation to disaster response and the issue of missing persons. So I will touch on that. Okay, so just to move along, in relation to the first thing I'd like to speak about, it's around how do we understand the dead body, how do we constitute it, and how is that relevant for the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, first of all, I would argue that the dead body should be seen as a social construct. There are a range of rituals that are performed, again highlighted by Heather as well, in the context of funerals, for example, and burial rites that have been infringed in the COVID-19 pandemic, but they do not abstract from deeply held beliefs and religious practices, cultural norms around how we manage our dead and how we perform burial rites and memorialisation in that regard. As one commentator pithily put it, dead bodies are personally and culturally significant to survivors. They are socially alive, although they may be biologically dead. And that is particularly poignant, I would say, in the Irish context, North and South. Death and death rituals have a particular, are deeply embedded in Irish beliefs and ways of knowing and seeing and understanding both community and how we remember those who have passed. And it's interesting examining some of the guidance around how we manage dead bodies that's been produced in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can see quite stark, I would argue, differences in terms on a UK basis between highlighting the way Northern Ireland is looking at guidance around managing the dead and dead bodies, as opposed to perhaps you might see under English guidance. And I will come to that in a moment. But just to point out in terms of an all-island basis, that obviously practices such as wakes, memorialisation, and celebrating that person's life are highly important, and I would say a particularly distinctive feature in terms of how that's expressed on this island. And that's something we need to take into account, even as we're trying to juggle the public health imperatives that may be presented in the context of a global pandemic involving an infectious disease such as COVID-19. So it leads me then to talk about the politics that we may be facing and what dead bodies can tell us about how the COVID-19 pandemic is being managed. As we may see, if you, for example, follow daily briefings of politicians in the UK, you will see, I'm going to put this in inverted commas, death by numbers, but there's a range of graphs that are presented about daily death tolls and cumulative death tolls. There's a lot of debate around exactly how many people have passed as a result of COVID-19 and the criteria that's used to identify who has died. And this has become a very overt political act in terms of how, for example, the UK government may be displaying their asserted effective management of the pandemic, and counter narratives that are coming in saying, well, actually, you're not fully accounting for all those who have died. And it tells us a lot in terms of how we count our dead, but also who's left in and who's left out. It points to pre-existing inequalities, I'd suggest, that were already there, that are being highlighted. For example, do we and are we properly including deaths that are occurring in care homes amongst the elderly, amongst those who are suffering from disabilities? So there's the extent to which we do not acknowledge them, does it aid in the political management of the epidemic, and does it show that we are valuing certain groups more in our society and others? So we need to be alive to that in terms of looking at how we count our dead as well in the context of a global public health emergency. I think what Heather said, and I would agree, is that the latest figures do show that we in the UK have the highest death toll in Europe, and that is deeply troubling, and there's lots of calls to analyse how and why that may be. Interestingly, looking at it on a north-south basis in terms of deaths per 100,000 people, the latest reports show an equivalence in that area. Now, there'd be a lot of debate about the extent to which, for example, in Northern Ireland, we are fully counting deaths that are occurring in care homes. In the south, they're much more comfortable that they are accounting for that. So it's interesting to look at what political steps have been taken to manage the pandemic and how that's playing out in relation to death tolls as well. So the politics of the dead and how we count them point us to greater issues that we need to consider around how we manage our societies and our relationships with one another in the context, of course, of the global public health emergency that is COVID-19. So the next point I'd like to move onto in terms of looking at how we constitute the body in this context, the dead body, is seeing the body as a source of contamination. Heather quite rightly pointed to the fact that managing the dead is depicted as a public health imperative in the context of managing an infectious disease such as COVID-19. There are long-standing issues and commitments around seeing the dead body as a source of contamination, as a source of infection that need to be managed. There's a tension that's presented, I suppose, in normative terms between the collective public health and the diseased individual body in that respect. By and large, and particularly in a range of legal instruments, bodies, particularly the dead, are seen as risky. It's certainly highlighted, for example, in the international health regulations, which are designed to manage global health emergencies, and also in a range of biosecurity laws that often operate at local and national level. They're long ingrained and depending on the disease may be appropriate. For example, what do we know about the risk of transmission of the virus from the dead? There's a range of guidance that's been published in that area, both in England and if we look north-south on this island as well. Certainly there's a view that there's a small but residual risk of transmission from the body of the deceased, particularly in the immediate aftermath, and that necessitates a range of precautions. Interestingly, in the latest guidance published in the Republic of Ireland, they're quite blunt, saying no evidence of so far of transmission of the virus through the handling of bodies. But again, there seems to be some variation of that, and the guidance is being updated regularly to take account of that. There's different views about how we manage the dead body that's coming through in the guidance as well. For example, in England, they're not too concerned about embalming, but that's not recommended on this island. But if it does go ahead, then certain precautions should be taken. So again, we've got the risk of transmission that's fitting into a very deeply entrenched narrative around the dead body being a source of contamination or whatever, source of contamination or infection that needs to be managed in a public health sense. But interestingly, in terms of the management of the dead in international disaster response, there's a major manual. It's been one of the most downloaded publications on the WHO website, which is about managing the dead in disaster response. And it's a manual for first responders. And they make the point that by and large, dead bodies do not pose a threat to the living. There are exceptions to that. And they note pre-COVID-19, of course, that that would be mainly Lassa or hemorrhagic fevers such as Ebola. But to just keep that in mind, because it produces a political and medical response that may be damaging to the management of the body where they do not pose a risk, and also to memorialisation practices of families and to mental health and well-being in the post-recovery period. So that's that sort of manual was written and designed by those engaged in forensic pathology, and so they see and manage and dissect the bodies and engage in identification of the bodies on a regular basis in that context. So they're at pains to point that out. So we do need a nuanced approach to understanding how we see the dead body as a source of contamination and how that feeds into the design and implementation of our laws. And I just make that as a general point while noting the specifics of managing deaths from COVID-19. Moving on to the second point that I'd like to highlight in my talk, which is all about the notion of the dead body in relationship. And again, Heather has nicely alluded to the relationships with family and friends and how that can be managed in the current context, and how that's been embedded or changed or interfered with in legal terms, particularly through the Coronavirus Act and a range of coronavirus regulations. In philosophical terms, the relationship, how should we understand that? Can the dead be harmed? Do the dead have interests? Again, a lively debate in the philosophical literature around that. I suppose I prefer the approach which says that the dead should be accorded respect and dignity on a posthumous basis. It's important on an ethical basis too, I would suggest, and this is picking up on what Jackie Leach-Scully has argued about the recognition of an ethics of care that operates between the dead and those that have an emotional attachment to them, family members, in making sure that they are properly buried and memorialised, in showing due respect to them and in showing a caring relationship in that regard. Obviously, we need to understand that relationship also in its legal aspect across a range of areas, from deaths to certification as well as to estates. So as also McGuinness and Brazier point out, death is not the end of the biographical person. That person who is now deceased lives on in family and friends. And it was interesting to note in some of the parliamentary debates during the coronavirus bill as it went through the UK Parliament that there was some suggestion that families, or even prior to deceased, the deceased wishes will be overridden on public health grounds in terms of how they'd like to be buried. And this caused significant concerns, while understanding the public health imperative of the need to memorialise the dead and to acknowledge that relationship with the living, both in terms of an ethics of care, but also given the emotional and social attachments that were important to family members and those that continue to live. And just picking up too on what Heather said, is that that relationship with the dead also impacts upon families in terms of their ability to grieve and in terms of their mental health and well-being. And I would agree with Heather that seems to be somewhat diminished or underplayed in the current environment. Much more so, I would say, sort of in the UK. I see much more, I suppose, sensitivity towards that in some of the guidance I'm reading on this island, which is good to see. And that failure to take account of the mental health perspective is an interesting approach here in the UK when you compare to the emphasis that is placed on the need to acknowledge that in international guidance, particularly in relation to managing the dead in disaster or public health responses. A proliferation of guidance, whether it's and laws, whether it's international humanitarian law, or you might find in forensic guidance or disaster victim identification, acknowledges that the failure to take account of the dead, identify them, memorialise them and return them to their families, to allow funeral and burial rights, is a recipe for poor mental health recovery on the part of the families, and that may also go to the missing as well. And it's interesting that a lot of the legislation to date in the UK, for example, has been particularly focused around the mechanics and the workforce issues and the potential for contamination around the management of the dead. But it would be good to see much more of an emphasis around, I suppose as Heather says, the physical aspects, but the mental health aspects that I think a lot of commentators are pointing to being a major issue post easing of the lockdown, but also highlighted in how our ability to memorialise the dead has been interfered with for valid public health reasons during the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so I'm just checking how much time I've got. So I would now, in the sort of final part of my talk, like to move on to talking about law and regulation in the area and what that might mean, building on the idea of the dead body as a social construct, the dead body as being in relationship with others. And what does that mean for how we design regulation in the area? Now, I come from a perspective which takes a fairly broad view of regulation. Binding law, for example, or what we would understand as lawyers in that regard, is just one instrument by which we encourage, I suppose, certain forms of behaviour, standard setting, a mix of hard and soft law. So it's a broader understanding of law's role in a regulatory process as a method of social control. So, for example, I would put particular legal regimes within that, such as human rights. I take the point that people may have a different view on that. But in terms of managing the dead, how would I understand the regulatory process? Well, clearly I see it as multi-level, crossing from the local, national to the international. When we're trying to understand how the dead is constituted and in relationship, we need to look to a range of international legal instruments, such as the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law, disaster victim identification guidelines, how the first responders manage the dead and the missing, for example. Just I highlight those, but what are the key points that come out of those forms of regulatory processes? Well, clearly the importance of identifying bodies, making them known so they can be returned and memorialised by families, the importance of treating the dead with respect and dignity, which has been highlighted by Heather as well. So therefore, burial and funeral rites must be appropriate. And most importantly, and I did highlight this before, respect for bereaved. That everything that professionals and governments should do, particularly at global level in the time of conflict or in natural disaster response, should be focused or should be aligned with the importance due to those who are bereaved, to families, and making sure that they can bury their family members. In that context, psychosocial support is seen as a particularly important part, alongside respecting cultural and religious rights around death. The importance of returning possessions, those emotional, sentimental mementos that connect you to the social life of the person, as I pointed out before, although they may be biologically dead. So at international level, you have this approach. We have a different approach, I suppose, in approaching this COVID-19 pandemic, I would suggest. A lot of it in terms of the Coronavirus Act and subsequent regulations, particularly in the UK, has been focused on dealing with a range of workforce issues, of managing concerns about systems, whether they be public health, whatever, being overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of COVID-19 cases and deaths relating from that. What we are going to see, and albeit it may be temporary, but we're not talking about, for example, under the Civil Contingencies Act of every 30 days we look at it. We're looking at 6 months. The Coronavirus Act itself in the UK could potentially go to 2 years and longer in certain regards. So we need to be mindful of what this may mean over an extended period, and what the dead body tells us about whether people's rights and ethics around our communities and how our relationships with each other are being managed. So just to finish off, I would also highlight that human rights are increasingly an important aspect of how we manage the dead, and Heather has pointed out quite a few interesting cases in that area. I've been quite taken by reading a lot of the work by commentators such as Stephanie Grant around managing irregular migration at the Mediterranean border, and because we're looking at a large number of people passing away as they attempt to migrate to the European Union, but also being unidentified and having families in different parts of the world, and trying to come to grips with the need to effectively manage that in terms of upholding those key ideas around respect, dignity, and acknowledging bereaved families. So some of the work that's been done in that area is really honing in on a number of human rights that may be applicable to managing dead bodies, and suggesting that an international treaty which focuses on this would be very beneficial. As to whether there's political will for that may be another thing. But clearly key human rights under the European Convention on Human Rights that would be engaged include right to life, prohibition against cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, the right to life, right to family life under Article 8 has been a key article that has been used in cases that have come before the European Court of Human Rights, and sometimes a prohibition against discrimination under Article 14. So what we're seeing are some examples of that I'd just like to highlight. For example, where there has been organ donation and transplantation post death, then there's a need and should be recognition that the body should be treated with respect even after death. That was held to be so in Alberta and Latvia. A real understanding of I suppose a growing understanding of the importance of taking account of the rights of bereaved relatives, and we can see in cases such as Jenna in Austria that they are seeking to claim both under Article 3 and Article 8, and that the right to family life can be breached through interference with return of the body and burial, and that was explored in the case of Abdulayeva and Russia. So yes, human rights do play a role. I would see it as part of a broader regulatory regime, multi-level regulatory regime that operates in relation to managing the dead, both in terms of how the dead body is constituted, as well as how we see it in relationship both with our families, friends and community. So just to sum up, I would point out that in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, while taking account of the public health dimensions of what we're facing and being overloaded on a systems basis, both in terms of our public bodies and our health system, there's a need to be mindful of what the dead body can tell us about our ethical, social, religious, and dare I say, the legal obligations we owe to the dead, as well as to those who remember them. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Anne-Maree, and thank you, Heather, as well. I think the two presentations fitted together so well this afternoon. We do have about 10 minutes left for questions or any comments to our contributors. If you'd like to use the chat function, we can work our way through them that way. It's probably a little bit simpler. While I let you type and pose your questions, I suppose I do have a question, I think, for each of our speakers. And Anne-Maree, I think it was really interesting where you were saying that, how we count the dead is essentially a political act. And I think, does that mean as well, can we carry that over when you were saying about, how the dead, discussions politically about how the dead are managed tend to be couched in the language of very technical or like system orientated language, like about workforces and like the technical aspects of not being contaminated by handling the bodies and things like that. Is that also then a political act as well, because it's focusing on management of the physical body, but not necessarily management of like the ethical or the social or the moral issues that are going to affect the bereaved and the communities that they come from? Oh, can I hear you? Can you turn your mic on?
Interesting question. I think, yes, in a way, law might encourage us to be quite technical in terms of how we put things in legislation. You can see that in the Coronavirus Act. But I suppose what I was trying to point out is we can learn a lot from other legal instruments as to where that sort of the dead body in relationship in its ethical social context, the importance of taking account of community and family has been undertaken. Maybe you could even suggest in certain countries such as the UK, they're not well used to dealing with these sorts of major public health emergencies. There's been a lot of practice elsewhere in Africa and Asia, and you would see that, I would suggest, coming out in international guidance around disaster response, for example. But I think that's right. If you can reduce it, for example, to graphs, to technocratic language, then the emotion behind, for example, or concerns about the fact that a country is not managing the response appropriately. For example, if you don't count deaths in care homes, then you don't need to engage in discussions about why testing is not available. Why can't families go and see their relatives in care homes? Why can't they bring them home, for example, to be with them? And there's some interesting case law just came down this week about that and the human rights implications of that. So, so then that just becomes a silence and a mission.
Thank you. And then my second question, I think, probably is for both of you, and you both touched on it around that. The emphasis at the moment has been around the protection of physical health by sort of viewing like the body as potentially contaminated or a risky thing, and that is something that needs to be dealt with. But as you both said, the essential part of the grieving process is that function, the rituals around funerals and around wakes and everything that goes with that. And I wondered if you would both be able to comment from your experience and the organisations that you're involved in, what are the potential mental health impacts of that situation? Do you want to start, Anne-Maree? I'm not sure.
Heather? Well, Heather's talking, so.
No, Heather had done the classic thing of not unmuting her mic there as well.
We've both been there already. So.
Yeah. What I was saying there, I know from discussions with people who I know in cruise bereavement, for example, that they are very, very worried about the long-term impacts of that. As I said in my talk, funerals are such a social ritual. It's not just about dealing with our dead, it's about drawing on that family, friend, community support network. And we're in the situation now where, unfortunately, the basic elements of someone passing away are being altered fundamentally. People are dying alone as a result of COVID-19. Family members can't be there. We have funerals where family members can't attend. The grief reaction around this, I think, is going to be phenomenal. And I think we will see it working out over the next few months. We're getting a taste of it now. My sense is that the longer term emotional impacts of this are something that we're going to see continuing as this rolls out. And I think it's something that we have to be mindful of, that there must be enough resources there within those agencies, those support bodies, to help people overcome the mental trauma and what this is going to produce as we move ahead. The other thing I think we'll see a lot more of as well are memorials as we move down the line. We tend to very much focus on the idea of funerals. I think a lot of families, once restrictions lift, once we move through this, might actually have some sort of collective memorial as a way of marking the life and passing of the deceased. But I do think there's going to be a huge emotional toll around this, and certainly a quick glance at the cruise bereavement website and all the advice that's available there as one example is a fairly good indication of what's happening.
Oh, thank you.
It was interesting, I think it was an editorial recently in the New England Journal of Medicine talking about the need to prepare for the next epidemic, the mental health epidemic that's coming our way post COVID-19, not even post. I think it's going to build, as Heather said. And they draw on a range of disasters, natural, man-made, that have occurred. And they say we've always seen in the post-disaster phase, we see increases in depression, increases in PTSD, substance abuse disorder, and a broad range of other mental and behavioural disorders, domestic violence and child abuse. So it's a phenomenon that's known about. And the question is, what are our respective governments doing to prepare for it? I think there's a fair amount of evidence that pre-existing mental health services are on its knees anyway in the UK. I wouldn't want to speak to the Republic, but certainly aware of that, and both at child level, adolescent level, as well as at adult. In Northern Ireland, it's known there's a higher rate of mental ill health than you would find in other places in the UK. So there's a pre-existing set of circumstances in Northern Ireland that we need to prepare for in terms of managing post-COVID-19, and also taking account of the fact of deeply held and entrenched beliefs around funerals and burial rites, and the importance of that to people on this island in ways in which mark it out from, England, for example. And I don't think that that's been fully taken account of. You can see that in Northern Ireland guidance, the need of a distinctive approach there, and there needs to be nuance.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I mean, it's nearly a question I'm nearly sorry that I asked, because it's potentially just such a disaster waiting to happen. But certainly something that we need to be extremely alive to. We have another question here in the chat bar from Conor McCormick. And he poses a question to both of you as to whether you have any thoughts on how governments can sensitively handle their obligations to investigate suspicious deaths on such a large scale in accordance with Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights.
I was like, Anne-Maree for this.
Okay. Go for it, Heather.
No, I suppose I would go back to Conor and maybe Anne-Maree's thoughts on this. What does he mean by investigate? What does he mean by suspicious deaths?
Do you mean under coronial laws? Is that what you're saying? Or death investigation law? Is that what you're saying in the Northern Irish context, or generally?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is asking once we prompt.
Okay. Do you want to come in on that, Conor?
Yeah, I probably should. So yeah, I have in mind primarily coroners' inquests. So suspicious probably wasn't the right word, but at least unusual deaths. And I suppose in terms of investigate, I'm thinking of the procedural investigation that arises under Article 2. So any thoughts, just because it's going to be such a unique exercise this time around, because while there's been huge investigations into large-scale deaths in the context of the likes of Bloody Sunday, nothing on this kind of scale before that's had to be dealt with under the auspices of the Convention. But we're probably out of time for such a...
I would say, of course, you need to have a look at the amendments that have been made to the need to report deaths arising from COVID-19, or the name of the virus, to the coroner, particularly in Northern Ireland. That, as I understand, maybe it's been removed, but also the no need for jury, the use of juries in inquests as well. So again, done on a workforce basis. And the need to not clog up the system. And also, I've seen in some of the explanatory notes also saying, well, it'd be too long a time for families, and they'd be sort of waiting on inquests. And so we're just going to do away with the whole process. But I think given what's happening around an elevated death toll, the impact upon families, and the management of our health system, I think there are interesting questions that could be asked, and perhaps using an Article 2 framework.
Yeah, and one other thing I would say there that just popped into my head, Conor, I don't think we had the same sort of legislation in place as in England and Wales, but if you think back to the Harold Shipman murders, the Manchester-based GP who killed quite a few of his patients and cremated their bodies to hide the evidence, that introduced the need for a second confirmatory medical certificate for all cremations in England and Wales. And going back to Anne-Maree's point about the mechanics of not allowing the system to back up, of keeping things moving, under the emergency powers in England and Wales now, you do not need that second doctor to sign the confirmation of cremation certificate. We just sort of abandon that step now for a while and allow the system to keep moving. So some of the normal checks and balances that we would usually have aren't there anymore.
I mean, the danger is, in the context of the use of emergency powers like this, is that you get mission creep.
Yep.
And that over time, it becomes normalized. Oh, this managed well, so let's relax that. I mean, it's a major issue, for example, in relation to deprivation of liberty safeguards for a moment for those lacking mental capacity in Northern Ireland. And, you know, so we need to be mindful of that. What's really interesting about the fact that you raise an Article 2 point is what we're seeing in the context of the use of these public health emergency powers is a reworking of human rights, I think. You know, we're seeing legal challenges. We're seeing more and more people coming forward saying, you know, where does the balance lie here, and can human rights help us find that balance? I'm mainly looking at mental health issues here at the moment, but you're seeing challenges around care homes and the ability, compliance issues around there and the risk posed by COVID-19. So I think law is going to be invigorated, and particularly human rights law, in a way that'll be interesting to see.
If we have time, we can maybe just squeeze in another couple of last questions. There's two really interesting questions here have popped up in the chat bar. The first is from Ciara Hackett, and Ciara raises the issue around the use of language around COVID-19, and in particular around the phrasing of this being like a war or a battle. And she was wondering, as you can see, if this language of like war and battle has found its way in discussions around death, and maybe particularly in relation to memorials. And is there any suggestion that the emotional response to the COVID-19 echoes responses after war or massacres or battles, for example?
Well, the first point I think I can deal with, Cheryl, I just thought that the use of the language, this sort of framing of a use of war rhetoric all the time, which we're seeing quite often, to me it spoke more about a framing of narrative. You know, I read a piece recently about how governments justify emergency powers by putting things on a war footing, and, you know, we're fighting an enemy and we have to, there's a narrative which justifies the extent of the powers. And I was thinking more in terms of there are certain similarities there. We're on this war footing now, we're fighting an invisible enemy. So maybe it speaks to this sort of idea of bringing a population together in a joint effort. But I also think it gives a government perhaps an idea in terms of how you frame this narrative to justify the various measures, the encroachments that you're imposing on society.
Sure.
I would also just add that I think Ciara does pick up on a really interesting point, is that elision between security, war, public health, emergency. And again, within the international relations literature, there is under critical security studies, they're using the dead body to highlight questions around that elision between security and health, and what it tells us about the politics of what's going on, about how we're managing individuals and communities. So I think you do raise a really interesting point. There's a growing literature actually in the area, and it's interesting around the management of public health emergencies. Increasingly, we talk about securitization. So there's a lot of discourse, and it may find meaning in, shall we say, more authoritarian or securitized practices that may feed into our laws. And that's why I think in human rights, challenges will become vital and important, as they always have been, but to be mindful of that as we proceed through this pandemic.
Super, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our questions this afternoon. I just wanted to issue some thank yous, both to everyone who tuned in this afternoon. I know people's schedules are already very busy, so taking the time out to come and join our seminar series is very welcome. But also, most importantly, to our two speakers this afternoon, Heather and Anne-Maree, who have, I think, really given us an absolutely fascinating conversation. I know for one, I've taken pages of notes here, and hopefully I'm going to go back and read over those and have a good think about that. But thank you so much for dealing with such a pressing but also such a sensitive and difficult topic with such compassion this afternoon. So thank you very much. If anyone is interested, we have another seminar series, another seminar next week on Thursday at 1 o'clock, and that's looking at issues around gender, issues around the home, family life and domestic violence in light of the restrictions posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So hopefully we will see some of you there. And thanks again for joining us this afternoon. Thanks.
And thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.